She kept the ledger open on her lap and her eyes on the gate. The gates never creaked. Tonight they groaned heavier than usual, dragged wide for something the perimeter guards had been ordered to cheer for, and clearly hated cheering for. A gray mare, a hand resting low on a stomach that had somewhere to be. 400 people were about to watch a marriage end in one sentence, and only one of them didn't yet know it. She thought she had 5 more minutes of an ordinary life left. She had 4. Somewhere behind a counselor's carefully arranged smile, a plan 2 years in the making was already counting down to its final hour, and the woman it had been built to bury hadn't even opened the door yet. The hall went quiet, the door began to open, the gates did not creak. Darius Vale had them oiled every season, because a king who couldn't afford a blacksmith couldn't afford anything, and appearances were the one budget he never cut. Marin noticed that. She noticed everything. It was after 5 years the only skill anyone had ever thanked her for. She was standing at the tall window of the east corridor when the sound reached her, not the gate itself, but what came after. The perimeter guards cheering, except it wasn't cheering. It was the sound men make when they've been told to be happy and are trying very hard to comply. She set down the tax ledger, smoothed the page flat, out of habit, a small ritual she performed whenever her chest started doing the thing she'd spent 5 years teaching it not to do. And then she walked to the window, because some part of her, the part that had ridden into border skirmishes when the scouts ran short, the part that never once looked away from a hard thing, refused to let tonight be the exception. Below, in a courtyard paved with black stone Darius had imported at twice the cost of the Eastern Road repairs, the procession came through. He rode first, chin up, spine straight, the tilt of his jaw she used to mistake for confidence and now recognized as rehearsal. Beside him a gray mare, saddled in a hurry, and on it a woman with dark hair pinned back and a traveling cloak worn thin at the hem, one hand resting low on her stomach like it had somewhere to be and was in no rush to get there. Marin did the math before her heart did, which took less time than she would have liked. 4 counts in, hold, 6 counts out, the same rhythm she'd taught 100 young scouts who came back from bad patrols with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Using it on herself now funny, she thought, except it wasn't funny. Nothing about tonight was going to be funny, and some small, stupid, still hopeful part of her kept waiting for someone to tell her it was a bad joke. Nobody did, so she turned from the window, picked the ledger back up. Read the next page straight through, because if she was going to fall apart, she intended to at least finish the tax column first. The great hall held 300 people standing. Tonight it held closer to 4. She walked in through the side corridor. Hadn't been summoned, filed that fact away, the way she filed everything now, in the drawer marked "deal with this later," and crossed the floor with her hands loose and her chin level, because the one thing nobody in this room could take from her yet was the way she walked. The path opened for her without anyone saying a word. 5 years of being indispensable bought you that much at least. Darius saw her first. His eyes found hers and held river ice gray, the color her father used to call dangerous water, and for exactly 1 second something moved behind them. Not pride, which was strange, because pride was the whole point of tonight. So if this wasn't pride flickering behind his eyes, then what she was looking at, for one unguarded second, before the king's face slid back down over it, was something closer to panic. She didn't have time to name it. He was already talking. Marin. He still said her name like it belonged to him. "You're here, good." She said nothing. 5 years of council sessions had taught her that silence held long enough made other people talk faster. He put a hand on the small of the woman's back. The whole room felt it a ripple, 300 faces recalculating in real time which expression was safe to wear. "This is Nadia." A pause for the name to land. "She'll be taking residence here." "Permanent quarters." Another pause, the one that mattered. The East Wing, the East Wing. Her mind processed the geography before it processed the meaning. Until the meaning arrived anyway, late, the way bad news always did. And it did not knock first. The East Wing sat past her own door. Every morning on her way to the council chamber, she would have to walk by it. "She carries my air." Somewhere near the dais, a counselor stood very still, watching not the king, not the girl, but her, with the satisfaction of a man watching a plan complete itself exactly on schedule. She didn't know his name yet. She only knew in the animal part of her brain that never stopped counting exits, that his stillness was the wrong kind. The hall had gone so quiet she could hear a boot shift on stone 12 feet away. East Wing, permanent here, and for one wild half-second, something in her chest lurched sideways. What if this is the moment I actually know? No, stop, not here, not in front of 400 people. She stood inside the gap between hearing and understanding, breathed through it, and kept her face exactly where it had been for 5 years. Which was nowhere, which was nothing. Nadia did not look at her. Kept her eyes fixed on a banner above the gallery rail, the posture of a woman told stand still, look elsewhere, let him talk. Marin looked at her anyway, recognized something in the girl's spine that read less like triumph and more like endurance. Then she looked back at Darius. 5 years, the Eastern Road still needed repair. The tax levy was still sitting on her desk because she was the only one who ever chased it. And now this a woman, a wing, and heir announced to 400 witnesses without one private word first. Congratulations, one word. She aimed it at neither of them, let it land somewhere in the direction of the ceiling, and turned before either of them could decide what to do with it. The noise started behind her before she reached the corridor. 400 voices releasing at once the sound of a crowd that had been holding its breath and finally got to let it go. She did not turn around to watch them enjoy it. She took the servants' stairs because they were faster, and because fast was the only thing she could currently afford to be. Her legs told her the truth first, the small, humiliating shake in them before the rest of her caught up. She stopped at a window seat on the 3rd floor and pressed both palms flat against her thighs, hard, like she could hold herself together through sheer downward pressure. 4 in hold, 6 out, which worked mostly the way it always did. Except this time there was a new thought riding underneath the breathing, quiet and unwelcome, that look on his face. That flicker before the mask came back down. Because if he'd wanted this, planned it, savored it, there should have been nothing in his eyes but the pleasure of it. There hadn't been pleasure. She filed that too. Everything got filed tonight. There would be time later to take the drawer out and go through it properly. There had to be 30 seconds. That was all she gave herself. Then she stood because sitting on a cold step was not a plan, and she needed more than she'd ever needed anything a plan. Her chambers were dark when she reached them. She lit one lamp, just the one, enough to see her own hands by, and stood in the middle of the room she'd lived in for 5 years, looking at it like she was already somewhere else, looking back. The wardrobe held 12 ceremonial gowns she would never wear again, and at the very back a cracked leather riding jacket she'd worn the day she left her father's house. She'd never been able to make herself give it away. Tonight she understood why. 3 trunks. She pulled them out and set them in a row beneath the window, and her hands simply started moving, because moving hands were easier than a still heart. The gowns stayed. They belonged to the palace, not to her. The jacket came. The tapestry on the far wall, 3 months of a weaver's careful work, the old founding family stitched into it, she looked at for a long moment and left exactly where it was. It had been made to live in that room. She wasn't going to punish a piece of cloth for the sins of the man who'd slept 2 doors down from it and hadn't, in truth, slept there in 8 months. She was folding the last shawl when the knock came. "Come in," she said, without looking up or don't. "I'm not going to stop either way." Nora Whitlock stood in the doorway. 22 years old, the kind of loyalty Marin had spent 5 years trying not to lean on too hard, because she knew what it cost a young woman to hand that kind of devotion to someone who might not always be able to protect her. Nora looked at the open trunks. Her face did something complicated. "What do you need?" "Nothing. Go to bed?" "No." The word came out fast, ahead of whatever was cracking behind it. The whole pack heard what he said, and nobody stood up. Not one person. "And I don't understand how you're just standing here folding a shawl like—" "Because folding a shawl is something I can do." Marin's voice stayed level, not cold, just level, the way you talk to someone standing too close to a ledge. "It's the one thing tonight that isn't falling apart in a corridor in front of 400 people. So I'm doing that instead." Silence. Nora understood that kind of silence. She'd watched Marin hold whole rooms together with less. "Let me help." Marin studied her for a long moment, long enough that Nora's chin came up, bracing for a no. Then she stepped back from the door. They worked without much talking. Nora knew which things were Marin's and which belonged to the palace. 5 years of quietly noticing, having taught her the difference without needing to ask. Below them, the sound of celebration climbed through the stone, 400 people, drinking to an unborn heir and a king's good fortune, and all the other things men toast to when they've gotten exactly what they wanted at someone else's expense. "Where will you go?" Nora asked, not looking up from the trunk clasp. Marin didn't answer right away, because the honest answer north, into territory even Darius had never managed to touch, sounded out loud, like the kind of plan only a desperate woman makes at midnight, which she supposed was exactly what she was. "North," she said finally. Nora's hands went still on the clasp. "North as in?" "North as in I'd rather ride into a territory that hates my husband than stand in a hallway and watch his mistress walk past my door every morning for the rest of my life." The girl didn't answer that, didn't need to. Marin pulled the old jacket on last. The weight of it settled across her shoulders like the first honest thing that had touched her all night. The stable yard was silent, frost sharp enough to bite on the first breath. She saddled her own mare herself, 4 years under her, steady as stone, and checked every strap twice, not once, because that was her father's rule. A strap checked once can still come loose on the first hard mile, and a woman running from a kingdom does not get a second mile to fix it in. The guard at the back gate was young. Corwin Ashgate, a boy she'd once pulled off a border patrol because he was coughing too hard to sit a horse properly, and had never once mentioned it since, because that wasn't the kind of thing you mentioned to a Luna. He looked at her now, at the trunks, at the jacket. at the whole quiet, terrible shape of what she'd become in the last 3 hours. He looked 1 second longer than a gate guard usually looks. Then he opened the gate, and as she passed through it, he touched 2 fingers to his jaw, the old pact gesture, the one that meant I see you, and said nothing at all. Because some things were safer left unsaid inside a palace that was, as of tonight, no longer honest with either of them. She didn't look back at the towers behind her. She'd made her peace, years ago, with looking hard things straight in the eye. But there was a difference between looking at something and staring at it until it broke you, and she was not going to give that palace the satisfaction of being the second one. The road widened at the first mile marker, then narrowed as it began to climb, trees thickening on either side, the dark deepening into the kind of black that has nothing to do with the absence of light and everything to do with wilderness. She had spent 5 years being the floor everyone else stood on. Tonight, for the first time in 5 years, nobody was standing on her at all, which should have felt like falling. It felt instead, and this frightened her more than anything said in that hall, like the first true breath she'd taken in longer than she could remember. 4 miles out, she heard hoofbeats behind her fast, gaining. Her hand found the blade at her hip out of habit. Not panic. Panic was a luxury she'd stopped affording herself somewhere around the second trunk. Whatever was coming up that road behind her in the dark, she intended to be looking straight at it when it arrived. She always was. The rider closed the distance fast enough that Marin's hand tightened once around the hilt at her hip and then loosened because she knew that seat. Knew the way the girl leaned too far forward at speed, like she trusted the horse more than she trusted her own balance. Nora, not a question, don't. Nora pulled up alongside her, breath fogging hard and the cold cloak half fastened like she'd dressed while already running. Don't tell me to go back. I've had 4 miles to think about all the ways you'd try, and I've already decided against every one of them. You have a life at Duskmere. I have a room at Duskmere. There's a difference, and you taught me that difference, so it's a little late to pretend you didn't. Marin looked at her for a long moment in the dark. The girl looked back, chin up, jaw set in that stubborn line that meant the conversation was already over whether Marin agreed to end it or not. Which was, Marin thought, infuriatingly familiar, because she'd worn that exact expression herself more than once in rooms full of men who outranked her and underestimated her in equal measure. If you come with me, she said finally, there's no easy road back. You understand that. I understand it better than you think. A beat. Are we riding, or are we standing in the cold arguing about a decision I already made 3 hours ago? Marin almost laughed. Almost. The sound that came out instead was smaller and rougher than a laugh, something closer to relief with its edges filed off. Keep up, then they rode. The road climbed for 2 days before it thought about being kind again. Frost thickened on the grass at dawn, burned off by mid-morning, came back harder by dusk, a rhythm Marin's body learned before her mind caught up to it, the way exhaustion teaches you things faster than reason ever could. They camped small, fires kept low, kept short, because a low fire was a fire nobody 2 ridgelines over could use to find you. Nora learned that lesson on the first night, watching Marin kick snow over the coals before either of them had finished eating. You've done this before, Nora said, not quite a question either. Once, a long time ago. Marin didn't elaborate, and Nora, to her enormous credit, didn't push. Some doors you learned to leave shut. Some silences were kinder than the truth behind them. By the second night, Nora had stopped flinching at every sound in the tree line. By the third, she'd started making the kind of small, dry jokes that meant she was settling into her own skin out here, jokes about the state of Marin's cooking, about the horse's opinion of the terrain, about how a woman who could balance a kingdom's entire grain ledger in her head apparently could not balance a single pot over an open fire without scorching it. I managed a war council for 5 years, Marin said, scraping burnt oats out of the pot with the flat edge of a knife. Nobody said anything about dinner. Maybe that's the real reason the marriage fell apart. The words landed before either of them expected them to. Nora's face went pale in the firelight, halfway to an apology, and then Marin laughed. Actually laughed, short and startled, the first real one in 3 days, and something in the girl's shoulders came down an inch when she heard it. Too soon? Nora asked. Ask me again in a year. They found the river crossing on the morning of the 4th day, low water running silver over stone, mist still clinging to the banks in slow, ghostly drifts. And on the far side, waiting 6 riders still unhurried, sitting their horses like men who were not surprised to see her, which meant somehow, impossibly, that they had been expecting her. Marin's hand found the reins tighter, old instinct, the kind that didn't ask permission. One rider sat apart from the rest, a little forward, and even across 40 yards of running water she could read something in the stillness of him, not patience. Confidence. The unbothered calm of a man who had never once found himself in a situation he couldn't handle and had therefore stopped expecting to. She crossed the water because turning around was no longer a plan that existed. Soot, her own black mare, steady as stone even here, scattered silver droplets up the far bank, and Marin stopped 10 feet from him and looked directly at the thing she'd read about for 3 years, and never once seen with her own eyes. "Cade Marrow, you're smaller than the report said." His voice came low, rougher than she expected, and entirely too amused for a man meeting a fugitive Luna at a border crossing at dawn. "The reports were written by men who never had to stand next to me in a council session." She let that sit a beat. "You're exactly as insufferable as the report said." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. He didn't look like a man who wasted those on strangers, but something adjacent to one. A flicker of genuine, startled amusement he hadn't planned on having this morning. "I've been called worse. Give it a week." Behind him, one of his riders made a sound that was almost a laugh and swallowed it fast, badly, at a single sideways look from his alpha. Nora, beside Marin, was doing significantly less to hide her own grin. Then the humor drained out of his face, all at once, the way weather changes on a mountain, and what was underneath it was harder, older, more careful. "You know I know why you're here." Marin's spine straightened. "Then you know more than I do. I'm still working that part out myself." "Not the leaving." His eyes didn't move off hers, the rest of it. "The part where a man in your husband's court spent 8 months making sure you'd end up exactly here, at exactly this crossing, on exactly this morning." The cold that went through her had nothing to do with the river. "Who?" He said the name like he'd been carrying it a while, waiting to set it down somewhere useful. "Silas Thorne." She knew that name. Had known it for 4 years, sat across from it in budget sessions, traded correspondence over grain allocation, read its careful, looping handwriting on 100 official documents. Had trusted it the way you trust the structural integrity of a floor, right up until the day the floor stood up and walked away with the whole house on its back. "He's a counselor, a bureaucrat. He argues about tariffs." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was, she supposed, the only skill she'd ever fully mastered. "He is not a man who plans things 8 months in advance. He's exactly that man. He's just very good at making sure nobody notices until it's too late to matter." Cade's jaw tightened, something old and unforgiving moving behind his eyes. "My people caught one of his scouts crossing, dressed as a traitor 8 months back. Followed him home instead of killing him, which in hindsight was the more useful choice. And he had 3 other meetings on that trip. 2 with pack lords who've been quiet for years, 1 with a young woman traveling under a merchant's name." He watched her face carefully as he said it, and she gave him nothing, because giving nothing was the only armor she had left. "Nadia." She didn't say the name back, let it sit behind her teeth where it couldn't give her away. "That's not proof of anything," she said. "Men travel. Meetings happen. I'm not handing you a court case." His voice stayed level, unhurried, a man who'd clearly decided a long time ago that honesty cost less in the long run than performance did. "I'm handing you what I actually know. Because you rode out of that palace with 3 trunks and a girl half your age, straight into my territory, and I'd rather you understood what you were walking into than find out the hard way later. Underestimating him once nearly cost my family everything it had." That last part landed differently than the rest, sharper. "Older your family." Something flickered across his face, not quite pain, more like the scar tissue left after pain is mostly healed, tender only if you press exactly the wrong spot. "There's history between Thorne's line and yours too. Older than either of you." He said it plainly, without ceremony, the way you'd hand someone a stone you'd been carrying too long. "Your father's family and his were on opposite sides of a debt of honor 3 generations back. I don't think this started with you at all, Marin. I think you were simply the most useful place for an old grudge to finally land." She stood very still on the riverbank, feeling the ground shift under a story she'd thought, until this exact moment, was entirely her own, which meant none of it, the humiliation, the East Wing, the pregnant girl on the gray mare, had ever really been about her at all. It had been about a ledger far older than her marriage, and she'd simply been standing in the room when someone finally decided to collect. "Why tell me this at a river crossing?" she said, quieter now, instead of waiting until I'd at least had breakfast. "Because you strike me as a woman who'd rather know a hard thing standing up than be surprised by it sitting down." He turned his horse without further ceremony, riders parting behind him to let her through. "Iron Hollow's a day's ride. You'll want the daylight." They rode. Iron Hollow announced itself the way honest things usually did, without decoration. Stone and heavy timber, low roofs built to shrug off wind instead of impress visitors, walls that had clearly been repaired many times and never once prettified. The intelligence reports had called it a fortified settlement, which was accurate in the same way calling a wolf a large dog was accurate. The watch posts at the corners were manned by men and women who tracked her arrival with eyes that evaluated rather than welcomed. Nobody moved to stop her. Nobody needed to Cade Road at the front, and that apparently was answer enough for everyone here. A young stable hand took Suit's reins, and Marin watched his hand settle on the mare's neck, competent, no wasted motion, and felt something in her chest, some old professional instinct, quietly adjust its estimate of this place upward by a notch. You'll have your own quarters, Cade said as a second man dealt with the pack horse. Not guest rooms, working space if you want it, as what? Observer. He glanced sideways at her, something almost testing in it. For now, she felt the old reflex rise in her, the instinct, honed over 5 years of standing beside a throne, to establish rank immediately, to make sure no one mistook her for a supplicant. She let it go, set it down deliberately, the way you set down a weapon you'd decided you didn't need for this particular fight. Observer's fine, he looked briefly genuinely surprised, like he'd expected an argument and found himself instead holding silence where one should have been. Her room smelled like pine resin and cold stone, and faintly the metal tang of a forge working somewhere below. She stood in the middle of them once he'd gone, and breathed the breath you take when a building has finally been lifted off your chest and your ribs are still remembering how that feels. Nora appeared in the doorway a moment later, took one look around and said, with the forced brightness of someone determined to find something nice to say about a room that smelled faintly of a smithy, "It's warm." "Go sleep, Nora. Are you going to sleep eventually?" "That's not a yes. It's the closest one you're getting tonight." Nora went. Marin sat at the writing desk under the frosted window long after the fire had burned low and let herself, for the first time since the courtyard, actually think about what 8 months meant. What a 3-generation grudge meant. What it meant that she had spent 5 years managing a kingdom's every invisible mechanism, every levy, every debt call, every quiet arrangement between lords who didn't trust each other, and Thorne had simply been waiting patiently for the one night that mechanism would walk out the door on its own 2 feet. He hadn't removed a wife. He'd removed the only person still doing the actual work. She picked up a blank page and began to write everything she could reconstruct from memory: 4 years of tax schedules, debt calls, private exemptions, the real reasons behind decisions that had official reasons and unofficial ones. She wrote in the shorthand she'd built for herself years ago, the kind nobody else in this entire fortress would be able to read. She wrote until the fire went out, and when it did, she didn't light it again. She simply sat in the dark a while, working, because the work was the only thing tonight that still made sense. The council met at mid-morning in a room built for fewer people than currently occupied it, a table dragged in from somewhere smaller, everyone elbow to elbow, nobody seeming to mind. Cade sat at the head with his arms crossed and a cup of something dark and steaming he did not offer to share, and Marin clocked it immediately as a small, deliberate test, not rudeness. See how she handled being left out of something. She didn't react. She read the room instead. A fighter across the table had the build of a man who worked with his hands and the eyes of a man who'd used them for worse. A woman a few seats down carried herself with the careful economy of someone managing an old injury, gray threading through dark hair pulled back hard. Freya Stonewell. Marin had heard the name in 3 separate intelligence reports, always in the same breath as the one who actually runs this place. Whatever the title on the door says. The subject on the table was supply. Winter had come early to 3 smaller territories along Iron Hollow's southern border, and the seasonal grain and fuel arrangement between them had collapsed under the strain, each territory hoarding what it had. Certain the others would do the same first, certain enough to make it true. "We've sent 2 formal requests for a joint accounting," one of the younger councilmen said, exhaustion flattening every word. "Nobody will open their stores first. Nobody trusts the numbers unless they wrote them. Then we take the shortfall by force before the passes freeze completely," the fighter said. "Simplest solution, simplest and stupidest," Freya said, not looking up. "You start a fight with your own neighbors going into the hardest months of the year, you'll win the grain and lose the spring. Nobody's offered anything better." Silence settled over the table, the kind that meant everyone knew their instinct was wrong, and nobody had a better one to offer instead. Marin waited 4 seconds, long enough to be sure this wasn't her fight to invite herself into. Long enough to remember suddenly and vividly that she'd solved this exact problem once before, years ago, for 3 eastern settlements who trusted each other even less than these 3 did. "You don't need a joint accounting," she said. "You need a system where no one has to trust anyone else's numbers, because no one is ever holding the full store at once." Every face at the table turned toward her. "A rotating custody model," she went on, keeping her voice level, unhurried, the voice she'd used in 100 council sessions where being the only woman in the room meant every word had to land clean the first time. "Each territory holds the shared surplus for a set number of weeks, then passes custody to the next, with an independent tally taken at the handoff, not before, not after. Nobody has to believe anyone's private ledger. They only have to witness one handoff at a time. And if someone shorts the store on their turn," the fighter asked, skeptical arms folding, "then the tally at the next handoff proves it publicly in front of the territory receiving custody, and everyone downstream knows exactly who to stop trusting." Marin let that settle. "I built something close to this for 3 settlements at Duskmere, who hated each other considerably more than these 3 do. It held for 2 winters. It would have held longer if I'd still been there to run it." Freya's eyes moved across the table to Cade. Something passed between them, quiet and unreadable, the shorthand of two people who'd worked together long enough not to need full sentences. You have this documented, Freya said, not a question. In my head, I can have it written out in enough detail to be usable by tonight. Do that, Cade said, and there was something new in his voice when he said it, not warmth exactly, but the beginning of something adjacent to respect, earned rather than assumed. I'll send riders to all 3 territories in the morning. The meeting broke not long after. Marin stayed at the table, writing, the council aide beside her fast and sharp with his questions, and by the time she finally stood to leave, her hand ached in a way it hadn't in months. A good ache, an honest one. Freya was waiting for her outside the council room, leaning against the stone like someone who had chosen this spot deliberately. You did that without asking permission first, Freya said. Not accusing, almost approving. I've spent 5 years asking permission for things I already knew how to do. Marin met her eyes. I'm trying to stop. Something moved across the older woman's face, recognition maybe, or memory. The look of someone glimpsing an earlier, harder version of themselves standing in front of them, wearing someone else's face. I ran this council alone for 6 years before Katie's father died and he took the seat, Freya said. Everyone assumed I was managing until a man was ready. Nobody asked whether I'd already been running the place better than any man before him. She let that sit a moment, something dry and knowing in it. You remind me of that year, not the grief. The part where nobody noticed the weight I was carrying until I set it down in front of them. Is that a warning? It's an invitation. Freya's mouth curved, small and real. Come find me when you're done proving yourself to men who should already know better. I have opinions about how to make them notice faster next time. Marin almost laughed, the second real laugh in 4 days, rarer than she'd like to admit. I may take you up on that, you will. I've seen the type. Freya pushed off the wall, already turning to go, and threw the last words back over her shoulder like she couldn't quite help herself. Welcome to Iron Hollow, Luna. Try not to make all of us look slow by comparison. Marin stood alone in the corridor a moment longer, the cold air sharp against her face, the ache in her writing hand still humming faintly. 4 days ago, she had been a woman standing at a window, watching her whole life ride through a gate without her. Tonight, she was standing in a stone hallway she'd known for less than a day, having just solved a problem 3 territories had failed to solve for a full season, and something in her chest, quiet and unfamiliar, had started, for the first time in longer than she could name, to feel almost like ground under her feet. Somewhere south of here, a courier was already saddling a horse he wasn't supposed to be riding, carrying a message that would reach Iron Hollow long before she was ready for it. She had no way of knowing that yet. She only knew, standing in that cold corridor with ink still drying on her fingers, that whatever came next, she intended to be looking straight at it when it arrived. The days that followed arranged themselves into something almost like a rhythm, which surprised her. Because 5 years at Duskmere had taught her that rhythm was a luxury reserved for people who weren't managing a kingdom's every quiet mechanism alone, and yet here she was, 10 days into exile, waking before the frost burned off the window glass, working until her hand ached and somehow calling it peace. Not peace, she corrected herself before the thought finished forming. Peace implied nothing was coming. This felt more like the stillness right before a held breath, the kind hunters know, the kind that means something is close enough to hear you if you move wrong. She was in the council room reviewing the grain rotation ledgers, her rotation model, 3 weeks in and already holding steadier than the old joint accounting system ever had when the door opened without a knock. Cade never knocked. She'd stopped expecting him to. But it wasn't Katie's face that stopped her mid-sentence. It was the object in his hands, a bird. Small, dark-feathered, one wing bent at a wrong angle, blood dried thin along its breast, and around its leg a strip of oiled paper, the kind used for messages meant to survive weather. One of the southern scouts found it tangled in a fence line. Cade set it gently on the table. The way a man sets down something he already suspects is more dangerous than it looks. Alive, barely. Somebody didn't want this one making it all the way home. Marin's hands went still on the ledger, because she recognized the paper before she'd even touched it. The weight of it, the fold. She unrolled it carefully, and there it was, small, cramped, careful handwriting, the kind that had signed 100 official documents she'd once trusted without question. Silas Thorne's hand, the message itself was short. Coded half of it, numbers standing in for names she didn't yet have the key to. But 2 words sat plain in the middle of it, needing no code at all. The convergence her stomach dropped before her mind caught up to why. 3 months, she said quietly, mostly to herself. The summit's 3 months out. Then whatever this is, Kata said, he's already counting down. She stared at the paper a long moment, feeling the cold of the room settle deeper into her chest than the actual temperature accounted for. Which was ridiculous. The room wasn't that cold, except it felt like it. Except her whole body had apparently decided that fear and frost registered the same way, and she was too tired to argue with it. I need the rest of this decoded, she said, every word. You'll have it by tonight. Cade paused at the door, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Marin. She looked up. Whatever's coming for that summit, it's not going to wait for you to be ready for it. His voice was low, steady, the gentleness of a man who didn't waste gentleness on people who couldn't handle the truth underneath it. So don't spend 3 months getting ready. Spend 3 months getting dangerous. He left before she could decide whether that was a comfort or a threat. It was, she decided later, both. Cora Blackwell arrived 4 days after the bird did. Nora saw her first a shape at the edge of the eastern wall in the deep blue hour before dawn, too thin to be a threat and too desperate-looking to be anything else. She came to Marin's window instead of the front gate, because, as she told Nora through chattering teeth, she could not risk coming through the front gate at all. Marin didn't recognize her right away. 6 years does things to a face, hollows it out in places, hardens it in others, the wear of a person who has spent a long time somewhere that does not permit softness. But then the woman grabbed her arm hard, the grip of someone who had ridden 6 days straight and had nothing left to spend on formality, and said one word. Marin. And something in the voice under the exhaustion under the years was still unmistakably the girl she'd grown up beside before either of them had ever heard the word Luna. Cora. They stood in the cold for a long moment, just looking at each other. Because there wasn't a version of this reunion that didn't need a moment first. Because 6 years was a long time to carry a friendship in a drawer without checking whether it had survived. How bad, Marin said finally, not a question of demand. Bad enough I rode 6 days without stopping properly. Cora's jaw tightened. Bad enough I couldn't put it in a letter in case it never reached you at all. Marin led her inside, sat her by the fire, waited because some truths could not be rushed toward, only walked toward slowly at the pace of the person carrying them. Tell me Thorn isn't just working against Darius, Marin said quietly. Tell me it's smaller than that. Cora looked at the fire instead of at her. It's not smaller than that, a breath. He's been building this 2 years. Not the marriage, not you specifically, not at first. The whole structure of the succession, Nadia, getting you out of the palace. All of it was always going to end at the convergence. The convergence, the same 2 words that had sat small and plain inside a dying bird's message. Confirmation landing worse than the first guess had, somehow because now it had a shape. What happens at the summit? Cora's eyes moved briefly to Nora, standing quiet by the door. She stays, Marin said. Whatever this is, she's already inside it with me. Cora nodded, slow, and turned back to the fire like it was easier to say the next part to flame than to a face. There's a petition being assembled, 6 pack lords signed, ready to bring before the full assembly. It challenges Darius's right to hold the throne on grounds of succession, of legitimacy, of stability. She paused, and the pause itself was its own kind of warning. The child Nadia is carrying isn't Darius's. The room went very still. Marin had suspected it, had turned the thought over more than once in the dark, quietly, the way you turn over a stone you're afraid to look under. But suspecting a thing and hearing it said plainly by someone who knew were entirely different weights to carry. Who's a man with no pack ties, no claim, nobody left to complicate the story he died 9 months ago in what was called a coastal accident. Cora's voice dropped further. Which nobody, including me, believes was an accident at all. Marin sat with that, let it settle into the shape it actually was, instead of the shape she wished it were. Because this was never about a wife being replaced. Which meant every hour she'd spent grieving her marriage in that lamplit room had been, in some small, furious way, a waste of grief spent on a wound that had never been the real one at all. The real wound was still coming. It was 3 months away, wearing a summit's clothes. When the paternity comes out at the convergence, Cora went on, it collapses the succession argument the 6 lords are using to back Darius's consolidation of power. In the vacuum that leaves someone else steps in as regent. Or the person Thorn is fronting for does who. Cora said a name from the old families, the ones that had existed before the current kingdom structure at all. A name Marin recognized only distantly, the way you recognize a word from a language you stopped studying years ago. How do you know all this? Marin asked. Quiet, careful. Because some part of her already suspected the answer, and some part of her did not want to hear it confirmed. Cora's jaw tightened, because I was part of it, until 4 months ago. There it was. They recruited me 2 years back through the coastal pack I'd joined after I left home. Cora forced herself to meet Marin's eyes, and it clearly cost her something to do it. I was supposed to watch your correspondence, report anything that suggested you were getting close to understanding what he was building. A breath. You never wrote anything dangerous. You were always too careful for that. But I stayed in long enough to learn the whole plan before I got out. Why are you here then? Marin's voice came out flatter than she meant it to. Not cruel, just tired. Why come to me at all, instead of just disappearing with what you know? Because when they told me the next stage wasn't about finding you anymore. Cora's voice cracked, just slightly, on the word. It was about making sure you couldn't interfere with the summit at all. The fire popped once loud in the silence that followed. Not locate you, Cora said, silence you. Marin looked at her for a long moment, this thinner, harder version of the girl who used to steal apples with her from the same orchard, who used to promise, at 14, that nothing would ever come between them. 6 years and a stolen loyalty later, here she was anyway, having ridden 6 days on the strength of whatever was left of that promise. Loose end. That was the phrase she understood now, sitting underneath everything Cora hadn't quite said yet. You could have vanished, Marin said quietly, kept what you knew and just disappeared. I could have. Cora's eyes were bright, fierce, the fire catching in them. But you're the only person I've ever known who actually deserved what she was given. And I wasn't going to let them put you in the ground as a loose end without at least trying to stop it. Marin didn't answer that right away. Because there wasn't a clean answer for it, not forgiveness, not quite trust, something harder one than either. The recognition that a person who had already been used once could still choose in a single moment to stop being used. Thank you, Marin said finally, simple and sufficient. The only true thing available. They gave the news time to settle before they let it fully land. A little time, a little food, a little ordinary warmth before the extraordinary weight came due. Nora had made dinner, nothing elaborate bread, a thin stew, the kind of meal that asked nothing of anyone, and she'd set 3 bowls instead of 2 without being told to, because by now she understood, without needing the words spelled out, that whatever Cora had brought with her was going to need company to survive the night. They ate mostly in silence, the good kind, the kind that doesn't need filling. You've barely eaten, Nora said to Marin eventually, nudging the bowl an inch closer. I'm thinking. You can think and eat. I've seen you do both while reading 3 ledgers at once. Marin almost smiled, picked up the spoon properly this time. You know, Nora said, quieter now, staring into her own bowl instead of at either of them, I used to watch you at Duskmer. Before any of this, the way you carried the whole kingdom on your back and never once let anyone see you sway. I swayed plenty, I just did it in rooms with the door shut. I know that now. Nora's voice caught just slightly and she pushed forward before it could catch again. My mother died when I was 6. My father wasn't. He wasn't built for raising anyone alone, and he knew it, so he sent me to the palace at 17 and called it an opportunity, a breath. I never had anyone who taught me how to stand in a room and not apologize for taking up space in it. Until you. Marin set the spoon down. You're the closest thing to a mother I've ever had, Nora said, fast now, like the words might not survive if she slowed down to examine them. I know it's not my place to say. But I needed you to know it, because after tonight, I don't know what any of us can promise about tomorrow. The room went very quiet, because Marin had spent 5 years being useful to a kingdom, and being loved by a husband who mistook usefulness for devotion, and somewhere in all of it she had actually forgotten. The way you forget the shape of your own face, that she was capable of being loved, simply plainly, for nothing at all except who she already was. Nora, her voice wasn't steady, she let it not be steady for once. You are not an obligation I'm managing, you never were. The girl's eyes went bright, and for a moment neither of them said anything else, because some things didn't need finishing in words at all, which was, of course, the exact moment the door opened. Cora came back in fast, breath-ragged, the urgency of someone who'd been listening at a window and heard something she wasn't supposed to. There's more, she said. I should have told you inside. I was trying to find the right way to say it, and there isn't one, so I'm just going to say it. Marin stood say it. Cora's eyes went to Nora, stayed there. Thorn has a niece, Cora said, placed in a palace years ago. A quiet arrangement, a favor to a struggling branch of the family, nothing anyone was meant to notice. A breath. I only learned the name 8 months ago when they started using her. The room tilted very slightly, the way a floor tilts right before you understand you've been standing on something that was never quite solid. Nora had gone white. Say it, Marin said again, quieter now, though some cold, calculating part of her had already done the arithmetic and did not like the answer it was arriving at. Nora Whitlock, Cora said, that's not her birth name. It's the name Thorn gave the arrangement when he placed her. Silence, the kind that has weight, the kind you can feel pressing on your chest like a hand. That's not. Nora's voice broke entirely on the second word. I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know any of it. I thought he wrote to me twice a year. Birthday letters. Nothing that ever felt like. I believe you, Marin said, fast, firm, before the girl's voice could shatter completely. Because she did believe her. Because 5 years of reading rooms for a living had taught her exactly what a lie looked like on a face, and this wasn't it. This was a 17-year-old sent somewhere by a family that had never once asked what she wanted, learning, at 22, exactly how much of her own life had been arranged without her knowledge or consent. 8 months ago, Cora said, gentler now, watching Nora with something like guilt of her own. That's when he activated her, asked her to write home more often. Small things at first, who visited, who left, what the mood in the palace was like. I never told him anything that mattered. Nora's hands were shaking. I swear that. I never, even when I didn't understand why he was asking, something in me never wanted to answer fully. I know. Marin crossed the room and took both of the girl's hands in hers, steady, deliberate, the way you hold something you refuse to let shatter. Listen to me. A man tried to use you as a door into my life before either of us ever met. That is not the same thing as you choosing to be one. But I could have been. Nora's voice cracked entirely now, tears finally spilling over. If he'd asked the right question at the right time, I might have answered without even understanding what I was handing him. But he didn't, and you didn't. Marin held her gaze unflinching. Blood doesn't choose anything, Nora. You do, and every single choice you've made since the night I packed those trunks has been for me, not for him. That's the only ledger that matters. Nora broke then properly, the kind of crying that had clearly been owed for years, and was only now finding a safe enough room to happen in. Marin held her through it, and over the girl's shoulder met Cora's eyes, a silent understanding passing between them, old friends recognizing in each other the exact same choice being made twice in one night. Loyalty, freely given after everything conspired against it, was worth more than loyalty that had never been tested at all. The camp had gone quiet by the time the alarm came. Not the deep quiet of safety, the thin, brittle quiet of a night holding its breath. Marin was still awake, Nora finally asleep in the next room, Cora's information spread across the desk in front of her like a map of a war she hadn't known she was already fighting, when the horn sounded once, short and sharp, from the outer wall. She was on her feet before she'd finished thinking about it. Cade met her in the corridor, already half-dressed for weather, a blade at his hip, his face carrying the calm of a man who had done this exact walk to this exact wall more times than he could count. Riders in the tree line, he said, east side, moving slow, staying low. Not traitors. How many? Enough that it isn't nothing. He looked at her, really looked the way he had at the river crossing, like he was recalculating something and didn't entirely like the new number. You should stay inside. I've never once stayed inside when something was coming for me. The words came out before she'd fully decided to say them, and once they were out, she found she meant everyone. I'm not starting tonight. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite approval, not quite worry, something braided from both. Then stay behind me, he said, not because I think you can't fight. Because I've already lost people standing where you're about to stand, and I'm not doing that again tonight if I can help it. She didn't argue. Some offers weren't about doubting your strength at all. They reached the wall as the first shapes broke the tree line, 6, maybe 7 riders, moving with the deliberate quiet of men who'd been told not to be seen, and were, by the sound of hooves on frozen ground, failing at it just enough to be heard. Iron Hollow's watch was already moving, already positioning, the disciplined quiet of people who had trained for exactly this kind of night more times than any of them would have liked. Stay here, Cade said low, and stepped in front of her on the wall, not dramatically, not for show, simply placing his body between her and the dark like it was the most obvious thing in the world to do. The riders came within bowshot and stopped. Sat their horses at the edge of the tree line, watching, calculating men who had expected an easier target and had just discovered a wall full of people who were not afraid of them. A long minute passed, the longest minute Marin had lived through in a year that had already handed her several unbearably long minutes. And then nothing. The riders turned, slow and deliberate, and melted back into the dark the way they'd come, choosing not to test a wall that had clearly already been warned they were coming. The tension didn't leave the wall all at once. It leaked out slowly, watch by watch, breath by breath, until Marin realized her hands had been gripping the stone hard enough to ache. Cade turned to her once the last hoofbeat had faded. You're shaking, he said, not unkindly. I'm fine. I didn't ask if you were fine. I said you're shaking. He studied her for a long moment, something quieter than the wall's tension settling into his voice instead. It's allowed, you know. Being afraid doesn't undo anything you did tonight. She looked at him, really looked in the thin moonlight, at a man who had put himself between her and an unknown threat without a single second of hesitation, without once asking what it cost him to do it. Why, she said finally, why any of this? The wall? The river crossing? All of it. You don't owe me anything. I know I don't. His voice was steady, low, entirely without performance. I didn't do this because you owe me, and I'm not doing it because I expect anything back for it either. He held her gaze, and something in it was more honest than anything Darius had ever managed to say to her in 5 years of marriage. I did it because I choose to. That's the whole reason. It's the only reason that's ever mattered to me. The words landed somewhere deep and unguarded, somewhere she hadn't let anyone reach in longer than she could name. Because she had spent 5 years being loved, if it could even be called that, as a function of her usefulness valued for the ledgers she balanced, the counsels she steadied, the kingdom she quietly held together while someone else wore the crown for it. She had learned, without ever fully admitting it to herself, to expect love only as a transaction. Something earned through service, never simply given. Which meant standing here now in the cold, hearing a man tell her plainly that his choice to protect her required no ledger at all, no service rendered, no debt owed, nothing except his own will. To do it undid something in her chest she hadn't realized was still so tightly wound. That's it, he said again, quieter. I choose to. Every time. For as long as you'll let me. She didn't have an answer ready. For once, standing on a cold wall with her hands still shaking and her whole carefully built composure sitting slightly askew, she didn't reach for one. She simply let the words be true, and let herself, for one unguarded moment, believe them. 3 months moved differently than Maren expected them to. Not slowly, not kindly. They moved the way a river moves under ice, fast beneath a surface that looked from a distance almost still. She rode circuits between territories she'd only ever read about in intelligence reports, carrying nothing in writing, because writing things down was how Thorn had built his own trap in the first place, and she refused to hand anyone the same rope twice. She carried it all in her head instead, every levy, every debt, every quiet arrangement Duskmare had ever made with a smaller pack that thought nobody was watching, which turned out to be the only currency that actually mattered out here. Not gold, not threats, information offered freely, asking nothing back except a willingness to listen. Most of them listened. Garrick Dunmore did not. His territory sat 2 days east of Iron Hollow, in country that did not forgive a wrong step, narrow passes, thin soil, the hard-won pride of people who had never once been handed anything easy. Garrick himself matched the land. Broad through the shoulders, gray at the temples, the slow, deliberate speech of a man who'd learned somewhere along the way that fast words got people killed. He didn't invite her past the gate. "We don't entertain political fugitives," he said, arms crossed, watching her the way you watch weather you don't trust yet. "Then don't entertain me." Maren held his stare, steady, unblinking. "Entertain the information. You can throw me out after." Silence, a man doing math on whether curiosity was worth the risk. Then from behind her, one word low, entirely unhelpful. "She's persistent," Cade said. "Comes with the territory." Garrick's eyes flicked to him. Something passed between the two men that Maren couldn't read, and didn't try to some old shorthand, built over years she hadn't been present for. He let them in. She laid it out plainly. Not the conspiracy, not yet. That particular card stayed in her hand, but the structure underneath it. What a weakened Duskmare meant for every small pack bordering it. What the levy schedules would look like under a regent instead of a king who at least occasionally listened to reason. What the trade routes would do to Garrick's own grain corridors specifically, because she'd built those routes herself years ago, and she knew exactly which threads unraveled first. Garrick listened, which was, she was learning, half the battle already won. "Why should I sign anything with you?" he said finally, "instead of just waiting to see how this plays out? You shouldn't sign anything with me." She let that land, watched the surprise flicker across his face. "Sign nothing with Thorn either. That's the whole ask. Restraint, documented in writing that you haven't committed to any petition not for my sake. For your own neck when this comes apart the way I think it will. And if it doesn't come apart, then you've lost nothing by waiting. And you've gained a witness who watched you hold your ground instead of grabbing for the nearest hand." Garrick studied her for a long moment, looked briefly at Cade, one more piece of that old unspoken shorthand passing between them. Then he signed. She should have felt like it was a victory. Mostly it was. Except some small, watchful part of her, the part that had learned to read rooms for a living, noticed the half-second too long he'd spent looking at Cade before he picked up the pen. Filed it away, told herself it was nothing. It was not, in the end, nothing. The nights at Iron Hollow between circuits had started arranging themselves around a fire in the courtyard where the horses were kept, Cade tending his own mount most evenings, Maren finding reasons to be there too, reasons that got thinner and less convincing every week, and which neither of them bothered pointing out. One evening, 3 weeks before the ride to Greywatch, he told her about his mother. He didn't build up to it, just said it, the way you finally set down something heavy you've been carrying so long your arms forgot they were tired. She was Luna once too, he said, running a brush along his horse's flank, not looking at Maren directly. A different territory south of here, a council that smiled at her for 11 years and then decided all at once that smiling had gotten expensive. Maren went very still. "They didn't do it the way Darius did it to you," Cade went on. "No public hall, no 400 witnesses, Queeter. A vote nobody told her was happening until it was already decided. She came home from a trade summit to find her name already struck from every ledger in the territory. Cade I was 9, his hands didn't stop moving on the horse's coat, steady, practiced, the discipline of a man keeping his hands busy so the rest of him could hold still too. I watched her pack 1 trunk, not 3, 1. Because by the time they were done with her there wasn't much left worth carrying. Maren's chest ached in a way she hadn't expected. Because she recognized every single detail of it, the trunk, the ledgers, the cruelty of being erased quietly instead of loudly, which somehow, impossibly, hurt worse. "Is that why you built this place?" she asked softly. "Independent, answerable to nobody. I built this place so nobody who lives inside these walls ever has to pack 1 trunk in the middle of the night and call it dignity." His eyes finally came up to hers, dark and steady in the firelight. "I watched a system decide my mother's worth for her once. I was never going to let that happen again. not to anyone under my protection. Which meant, Marin understood suddenly, sitting with the fire warm against her face, she wasn't the first wounded thing he'd ever chosen to stand in front of. She was simply the first one who'd stayed long enough to notice. What happened to her, Marin asked. Your mother. After she's alive, runs a modest trade house 2 territories over. Content mostly, a ghost of something almost like a smile. She still asks, every letter, whether I've found someone who argues with me instead of just agreeing with everything I say. What do you tell her? I hadn't found anyone like that. He held her gaze steady, unhurried. Until recently, she didn't have an answer ready for that. For once, she let the silence sit instead of filling it. The letter came 8 days before they were due to ride for Greywatch. Cora brought it to her personally, face carefully arranged into something neutral that didn't stay neutral for long. One of my old contacts on the coast, Cora said, setting the paper down like it might bite her. He still owes me a debt from before I got out. This is what he sent instead of paying it. Marin read it once, then again slower because the first reading had refused to fully land. A meeting, 3 weeks back, a private inn on the border between Garrick's territory and Duskmere's eastern reach. Garrick Dunmore, and a man matching the description of one of Thorne's known intermediaries. The floor tilted very slightly under her feet. This could be nothing, Nora said quietly, reading over her shoulder. A trade meeting, territory business that has nothing to do with any of this. It could be. Marin's voice came out flatter than she meant it to. Except Garrick doesn't take unscheduled meetings on borders he doesn't control. He told me that himself the day I met him, called it sloppy, which meant this wasn't sloppy at all, which meant it was deliberate and hidden, and exactly the kind of quiet arrangement she'd spent 5 years learning to spot from across a council table. She rode for his territory the next morning, alone except for Cade, who insisted and did not take no for an answer, and she found she didn't especially want him to. Garrick met them at his own gate this time, no hesitation. Which in its own way told her something too. You met with one of Thorne's men, she said. No preamble, no softening, 3 weeks ago, a border inn. I want to hear it from you before I hear anything else about it from anyone else. Something shifted behind Garrick's eyes, not guilt exactly. Calculation, a man deciding in real time how much of the truth was survivable to hand over. I met with him, he said finally, because he offered me something you never did. Which was certainty. The word came out heavy, tired. You offered me restraint, a promise that if I waited I might not lose everything. He offered me a guarantee in writing that my territory keeps its trade routes no matter who sits on the throne when this is finished. A pause. I have 400 people who eat because those routes hold. I don't have the luxury of betting all of them on hope. So you signed with him instead. I didn't sign anything. His jaw tightened. I listened, the same as I listened to you. I haven't given either of you my name on paper yet. Marin studied him for a long moment, feeling something cold and clear settle into place behind her ribs. Because this was the thing nobody at Duskmere had ever taught her to prepare for, not treachery dressed as malice, but treachery dressed as exhaustion. A tired man protecting people he actually loved, choosing the safest bet instead of the right one. Which didn't make it forgivable, but it made it somehow worse. Harder to simply be angry at when the summit comes, she said quietly. You'll have to choose. Not listen, choose. And whichever way you choose, I need you to understand I will remember which one it was. That sounds like a threat. It's not. She held his gaze steady. It's a promise, the same kind you're apparently in the business of making to everyone lately. She left without another word. Rode most of the way back to Iron Hollow in silence, Cade beside her, neither of them filling the quiet with anything that didn't need saying. You handled that better than I would have, he said eventually. I wanted to scream at him. The confession came out low, almost surprised at itself. Which surprised me, because I thought I'd used up all my anger already back at Duskmere, standing in that hall. Except apparently there's more where that came from. Apparently there's always more. Good, Cade said simply. Save it. You're going to need it at the summit. Greywatch Plateau announced itself the way important places always did, not with grandeur, but with sheer scale. A wide, flat expanse of gray stone where 3 territories met, chosen generations back precisely because it belonged to none of them, and therefore in some fragile way to all of them. They arrived on the 3rd day of a 5-day gathering. Deliberately, not the first day when positions were still soft and unformed. Not the last when decisions had already hardened past reasoning. The middle where tension sat highest and uncertainty was still worth something to whoever moved first. She rode in with Cade half a length behind her right shoulder, Nora at her left, Cora 2 positions back, and a formation of allied riders spread wide enough to say, without a single word needing to be spoken, that this was not a delegation that had wandered in late hoping to go unnoticed. The summit announced itself on the wind before it announced itself visually, the low continuous hum of hundreds of people occupying one confined space, the smell of cook fires, an atmosphere where a great deal of carefully managed political tension had nowhere left to go but up. She found Duskmere's encampment by instinct alone. larger than 5 years ago, more formal. The kind of display that meant someone had spent considerable effort projecting stability while feeling underneath it anything but. And there, outside the largest pavilion, standing with two counselors, waiting for something he both wanted and dreaded, Darius. He saw her the same instant she saw him. She had spent 3 months preparing for this exact moment, rehearsing it almost in the quiet hours between circuits, what she would feel, what she would let show, what she owed herself in the way of composure after everything. She had thought she was ready, she was almost ready, because he looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in months, jaw tighter than it naturally sat, eyes carrying that compressed brightness of someone running purely on adrenaline. And despite everything, despite the hall, the trunks, the frost on the road north, some small, unwelcome, entirely involuntary part of her recognized 5 years of proximity before her mind could catch up and shut the recognition down. She didn't let it reach her face, didn't slow her pace. Rode straight through, toward where Cade's banner was already going up at the northern edge of camp, and did not look at Darius again. She felt him watching the whole way across the stone. Nadia she saw only once that first day at a distance, near the edge of the Duskmere encampment. The girl was thinner than Marin remembered from that terrible night in the courtyard. Pallid. She stood very still while two attendants fussed over some detail of her dress, wearing the composed exhaustion of someone who has been performing a role for so long that the performance and the person underneath it have started to blur together. Their eyes met once across 40 yards of trampled grass. Marin expected anger, her own anger rising fast and familiar, the easiest feeling available. What she felt instead, watching Nadia's face, was something far more complicated. Something that looked, from where Marin stood, less like triumph and more like a woman drowning quietly in plain sight, waiting for anyone to notice she'd never once asked to be handed this particular weight. Neither of them looked away first, neither of them approached either. But something passed between them anyway, wordless, brief. Impossible to name cleanly the recognition of two women who had both, in their own separate ways, been made into pieces on the exact same board. The formal session convened at midday under the great pavilion, heavy pole timbers, oiled canvas worn smooth by decades of exactly this kind of gathering. The accumulated weight of 100 years of high-stakes negotiation pressed into every worn board underfoot. Elder Osric presided from the raised stone at the center, ancient, weathered, carrying authority the way only decades of accumulated credibility could earn it. Marin sat with the Iron Hollow delegation, Cade beside her, and watched the room the way she'd learned to watch every room that mattered, reading faces, reading distances, reading the quality of attention a man pays when he's tracking two conversations at once. Silas Thorne sat 3 sections across the pavilion. She hadn't seen him yet in person since the night of the humiliation, had only ever pictured him through the reports, the correspondence, the careful looping handwriting she now recognized as a weapon rather than a courtesy. In person, he looked smaller than the damage he'd caused, which somehow made it worse. The petition came during the open floor period. Darius stood within his rights. Any delegation head could, and the formal language of summit procedure fell out of him with the ease of a man who'd rehearsed it in a mirror. In light of ongoing concerns regarding succession stability at Duskmere, he said, the delegation petitions this assembly to formally recognize Nadia Sorrel as Luna designate, her status to be confirmed by the assembled lords. The pavilion received it the way a held breath receives, release a ripple of attention turning, all at once toward the northern edge where Iron Hollow's banner stood. Marin. Her heart was doing something complicated and fast beneath her ribs, which please, not now, not here, not in front of every lord who mattered, and she breathed through it exactly the way she'd taught 100 frightened scouts to breathe. 4 in holds, until her own voice, when it finally came, arrived steady enough to be believed. The summit recognizes the concerns raised, she said, loud enough to carry, as concerns that deserve real scrutiny. Not a rushed vote built on a petition assembled in shadow. She laid out what she had, the pattern of Thorne's movements over the past 2 years. Garrick's account of the border meeting offered at the last moment with visible reluctance, standing at her side, choosing finally the harder truth. Cora's testimony about her own recruitment, the wounded bird, the coded message, the 2 words that needed no code at all. It was substantial, it was true. It was not, she understood with a cold, sinking certainty as she watched the Lord's faces, quite enough. Because a message half decoded wasn't proof, because a defector's word could be called a grudge. Because Garrick's account, however honest, was still one man's memory of one conversation, easily painted as confusion or coincidence by anyone determined enough to paint it that way. Thorne rose, composed, careful. A man who had spent decades perfecting the exact temperature of calm that made accusations sound like hysteria by comparison. These are serious claims, he said, voice smooth as poured water. Built entirely on the word of a woman removed from her position for conduct this assembly has not yet examined. A defector with every reason to invent a story that returns her to relevance. and a single lord's account of a meeting that could as easily have been ordinary trade business. He let that settle. Where is the proof that survives more than one telling? Silence. A room realizing the accusation, however true it felt, did not yet have teeth sharp enough to hold. Maren felt the Lord's attention shifting under her, slow and physical, like sand moving underfoot in a current she couldn't fully see. Watched 2 of the 6 petition signatories exchange a glance she recognized instantly, men recalculating which side currently held more weight. Elder Osric's voice, when it came, carried the weariness of a man who had presided over enough summits to know exactly how this kind of silence usually resolved. The Assembly will take the petition under continued consideration, he said. Further testimony will be heard before any final vote. It wasn't a defeat, not yet, but it wasn't the victory she'd needed either, and everyone in that pavilion, herself included, understood exactly which direction the room had just leaned. She stood very still at the center of it, alone in the way that comes from a room full of watching faces choosing, one by one, not to speak on your behalf. No one rose to back her further. No one needed to say it aloud, for her to feel it, the room deciding quietly. That hope for Duskmere's stability now weighed more, for tonight at least, than the truth she'd carried 3 months to bring here. She did not let her face show it. 5 years had built that armor, and 3 months in exile had only sharpened it. But walking back to the Iron Hollow encampment afterward, Cade silent and steady beside her, she let herself feel just for the length of that walk, just where no one else could see it, exactly how much it cost to stand alone in a room and still be found wanting. The fight wasn't over, it had simply finally begun. The night after the vote deferred, Maren didn't sleep, which had become, somewhere in these 3 months, less a failure of hers and more a kind of ritual, the lamp low, the ledgers closed, the clarity that only came to her after midnight, when the rest of the world had finally stopped demanding anything from her. Freya found her there. Didn't knock either, apparently. That was simply how people showed up in her life now, uninvited and exactly on time. "You're missing one piece," Freya said, setting a folded paper on the desk without preamble. "I've been sitting on it longer than I should have, because I wasn't sure yet whether you'd earned it." Maren unfolded it slowly, a ledger page, old. The ink faded, but the handwriting unmistakable. Thorne's careful looping script dated 11 years back, listing a debt of honor owed by a family whose name Maren recognized instantly. Her father's family. "Where did you get this?" "I've been Alpha's counsel here longer than Katie's been alive," Freya said simply. "You learn to keep the things men like Thorne assume nobody bothered to write down." A pause waited. "This proves the grudge predates you by a generation. Which means it proves premeditation, which means finally it isn't just your word and a defector's memory anymore." Maren's hands weren't quite steady on the page, because this changed everything, not the truth of it, which she'd already half suspected, but the shape of it in front of a room that needed hard edges instead of soft suspicion. "Why now?" Maren asked. "You could have handed me this 3 months ago, because 3 months ago you were a woman running from a humiliation." Freya's eyes were steady, unflinching. "Tonight you're a woman who built a working alliance from nothing, held a summit floor alone when the room turned on you, and didn't flinch once in front of every lord who wanted you to." A small, real smile. "I don't hand my proof to just anyone, Luna. I hand it to people who've shown me they'll use it correctly." Maren looked at the paper a moment longer, then up at Freya. "You could have told me that a little sooner," she said. "Would have saved me some very long nights, would it though?" Freya's smile deepened, dry and knowing. "I don't think you'd have believed it fully until you'd earned it the hard way. Nobody does. That's rather the point of the hard way." Cora arrived within the hour, breathless, having clearly run rather than walked once word reached her. "There's more," she said, before Maren had even finished refolding Freya's ledger page. "Something I should have told you the moment I heard it, except I wasn't sure it was true, and I didn't want to hand you false hope on top of everything else." "Tell me anyway." Thorne's healer. Cora's breath was still catching. "One of my old coastal contacts, she treats half the summit's senior delegations, including his. She let it slip, mostly by accident, that he's been buying a very specific medicine. The kind you only need when the body's already decided your time is short." The room went quiet, because this reframed something Maren hadn't fully let herself examine, the sheer relentless speed of it all. 2 years of patient groundwork, and then in the last 8 months, a sudden, almost desperate acceleration. "He's dying," Maren said slowly. "That's what it sounds like." Which meant none of this, the 8 months, the wounded bird, the summit deadline, had ever been about patience at all. It had been about a man racing his own body to finish something before his body finished him first. Maren sat with that a long moment. Felt something complicated move through her chest, not sympathy, not quite, because sympathy implied forgiveness she wasn't prepared to hand him, but something adjacent to it, the recognition that even the man who'd built her ruin brick by brick was, underneath the calculation, simply afraid of running out of time. It didn't excuse what he'd done. Nothing excused what he'd done. But it explained finally why he'd been willing to burn through every safer, slower option to get here. "Does this help us?" Nora asked quietly, from the doorway, where she'd clearly been listening longer than any of them had noticed. "It helps us understand him," Marin said. "It doesn't stop him." If anything, she stopped, the thought landing hard and cold. If anything, a man with nothing left to lose is more dangerous tomorrow than he's ever been. The final session convened at midday, the pavilion fuller than it had been all week. Word travels fast at a summit, and word had clearly traveled that something was coming to a head. Marin stood at the center of the floor with Freya's ledger page in one hand and 3 months of careful, patient work behind her. Kate at her right, Cora and Nora just behind. Garrick Dunmore, notably, standing at the edge of the Iron Hollow section rather than his own, a small, silent statement that hadn't gone unnoticed by anyone in the room. She laid it all out, not rushed, not desperate, the measured calm of a woman who had learned, over 5 years and 3 months combined, exactly how to make a room listen without raising her voice. The ledger page dated 11 years back. The pattern of Thorne's movements matched against Cora's first-hand account. The wounded bird's message, fully decoded, naming dates and meetings that lined up, one after another, like teeth in a lock finally turning. And then, because some truths only land when a person says them about themselves, Garrick stepped forward. "I met with one of his men," Garrick said, voice carrying flat and plain across the pavilion. 3 weeks before this summit, I was offered certainty in exchange for silence. I didn't take the offer. But I should have said so publicly the moment I understood what I was actually being asked to trade. He looked briefly at Marin. I'm saying it now, the room shifted, not dramatically, but visibly a floor reweighting itself, one lord at a time, deciding which side had actually earned its footing. Thorne rose to answer it, composed still, though something in his face had changed since the last session, a tightness around the eyes that hadn't been there before, the strain of a man running on less time than anyone in the room yet understood. "A ledger page," he said, "proves an old debt, nothing more." "It proves motive," Marin said, "which is the one thing you never gave me a reason to look for before yesterday." She let that land. "You didn't just want the throne destabilized, Silas. You wanted it collected on. A debt older than either of us, called in on a schedule that only makes sense if you're a man who no longer has years left to wait." Something flickered across his face, not quite fear. Recognition. "You've been talking to my healer," he said quietly. "I've been talking to people who've watched you long enough to see what you were trying to hide." Marin held his gaze steady. "I'm not here to take anything from you that time isn't already taking. I'm here to make sure you don't take anyone else down with you on the way out." The pavilion had gone utterly silent, and in that silence, Elder Osric's voice, low and grave, carried further than it needed to. "Silas Thorne, the Assembly has heard sufficient testimony to proceed toward formal judgment. This session will recess briefly while the ruling is prepared." It was Nadia who moved first in the lull that followed before the recess had properly settled, before anyone had risen from their seats. She stepped forward from the Duskmer section, unescorted, unannounced. The quiet courage of a woman who had spent 3 months deciding this exact moment was worth whatever it cost her. "Before you deliberate," she said, her voice smaller than the pavilion but somehow carrying anyway, "there's something I need to say myself. Not through anyone else's testimony." Darius's face watching her went pale. "The child I carry isn't yours," Nadia said, and the words landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. "I didn't know that when I arrived. I was told a story, and I believed it because believing it was easier than asking who benefited from me believing it." Her chin lifted, small but unmistakable. "I'm done being a piece moved by someone else's hand. I wanted the Assembly to hear that from me, not from a page, before any ruling was made." The room held its breath. Marin watched her, this young woman who had once stood beside Darius wearing another woman's stolen future, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel walking into this pavilion. Not triumph, something closer to solidarity. Two women aimed at each other by men with far more to gain from their rivalry than from their honesty, choosing in the end not to be enemies at all. It was into that same recess the Assembly not yet dismissed. Attendants already moving through the pavilion, pouring the ceremonial wine that traditionally accompanied a summit's closing deliberations, that the danger came exactly when no one expected it. Marin saw it because she'd spent 5 years learning to watch hands instead of faces. A server near Darius's section, young, unremarkable, the kind of face built specifically to be forgettable, tipped something small and dark from his sleeve into one particular cup before setting it, with practiced care, directly in front of the king. Her heart lurched, because she recognized him, suddenly and completely, from somewhere years buried, a soldier she'd once shielded from public discipline over a missing supply report that hadn't been his fault at all. Quietly rewriting the record herself, rather than let him take a flogging meant for someone else's carelessness. A kindness so small she'd genuinely forgotten she'd ever offered it. He hadn't forgotten. Wait, the word left her before she'd finished thinking it, too loud for the room, too late to undo what was already moving. The server's hand froze over the cup. Everyone turned. which meant everyone saw exactly what happened next, the young man's face crumbling, not with the resolve of an assassin completing an order, but with the anguish of someone who had spent weeks being told this was the only way out of a debt he'd never actually chosen to owe. "I can't," he said, mostly to himself, and then louder, to the whole silent pavilion. "I can't do this, not to her, not after." He looked at Marin, something broken and grateful moving across his face all at once. "You cleared my name once when nobody else would have. I've carried that longer than I've carried anything Thorn ever gave me." He set the cup down, untouched, stepped back from the table with his hands raised, shaking, and said nothing else at all because nothing else needed saying. Thorn's face across the pavilion went the gray of a man watching his last card fail to land. Guards moved, quiet, efficient, the summit's own order restoring itself around the edges of what had almost happened. Thorn didn't run, didn't fight it. Simply stood, very still, a man who had spent every remaining ounce of borrowed time on a plan that had just come apart in front of the whole assembly, undone not by force, but by a debt of kindness he'd never once accounted for in all his careful calculations. Only once that stillness had settled, once the wine was cleared and the guards had taken their positions, and the room had remembered how to breathe, did the assembly reconvene to deliver what it had already decided in every way that mattered. The verdict came before sundown. Thorn, stripped of counsel's standing, remanded to territorial custody pending full inquiry, though everyone in that pavilion understood, without needing it said aloud, that whatever time remained to him would likely be served out somewhere quieter than a cell. The 6 lords who had signed the original petition issued their formal withdrawal. One by one, the careful language of men protecting what remained of their own standing. Nadia was released from any claim to the Luna designation, her testimony entered as cooperative, a quiet request for safe passage south noted and granted without argument. And the Northern Alliance Iron Hollow, Garrick's territory, and the smaller packs who'd finally formally aligned once the truth stood undeniable in front of them was recognized as a sovereign political body, standing equal to any territory of comparable size. Elder Osric, reading the final decision into the record, looked directly at Marin as he finished. The look of a man who had presided over enough summits to recognize, when he saw it, the rare kind that actually changed something lasting. She held his gaze, nodded once, he nodded back. Darius found her at the edge of the plateau as the light went long and gold across the stone. He came alone, no advisors, no guards at careful distance. Either trust or theater, and she'd learned over 5 years exactly how to tell the difference in him. It was trust. She gave him that much. "I owe you more than I know how to say," he said. "You don't owe me anything." Her voice came out steady, certain. "What happened today happened because the kingdom needed it to. Not for me, not for you." His jaw moved the motion she'd seen 1,000 times, a man holding back something he didn't know how to shape into words. "I know," he said finally. Just that, 2 words. They carried more weight than every formal speech he'd ever given her in 5 years of marriage combined. "Govern properly this time," she said. "The Eastern Road still needs the funding I argued for. Find someone competent to manage the levy schedule, because it won't manage itself, no matter how much you'd like it to." A pause. "You know how to lead in front of a crowd. You never learned how to govern in the quiet where nobody's watching to be impressed. Learn it now, while you still have people willing to teach you." He looked at her with the expression of a man receiving something he hadn't earned and knew it plainly. "Is there anything," he started, "that would make you—" "No, gentle, final there isn't, and I think some part of you already knew that standing here." He held the word the way a person holds a door finally closing for good. Then he straightened, not his performance this time, simply a man accepting the shape of what remained his and what no longer was. "The Alliance will have full trade access," he said. "As far as I can make it hold, I know you will. That part you were always good at." He turned and walked back toward Duskmir's encampment. She watched him go until the light swallowed the distance between them and felt, for the first time in 3 months, something settle quietly into place inside her chest. Not grief anymore, something closer to peace. Spring came to Iron Hollow the way it always did in the north, slow, unhurried, snow retreating off the ridgeline in patient stages, the air carrying that first undercurrent of something thawing beneath ground that had been frozen far too long. Nora left for the coast that same season, riding her own commission as Iron Hollow's first correspondent to the southern packs, a role she'd built for herself, quietly, without waiting to be given permission first. "Don't write only about the work," Marin told her, the morning she left. "I know." Nora's eyes were bright, but steady this time, not breaking the way they had that terrible night by the fire. "Write about you too, I know." "Go," Marin said, and meant it as the gift it was. Cora stayed longer, then left too eventually, building a quiet network of her own along the coast under a name nobody from her old life would recognize, a woman finally building something that belonged entirely to herself. Marin found Cade in the stable at dawn one morning in early spring, tending his horse the way he always did, unhurried, present, entirely himself. She stood in the doorway a moment, just watching, then stepped inside. Last signature came through yesterday, she said. The Alliance Charter fully ratified, I heard. He didn't look up from the brush moving along the horse's flank. You did that, we did that. She crossed the space between them, close enough now that the horse shifted, unbothered, used to both of them by now. I need to say something, and I need you to actually listen instead of just being politely quiet about it the way you do. That got his attention. He straightened, brush still in hand, and looked at her fully. I'm not going back to any palace, she said, not as anyone's Luna. Not standing beside a throne while someone else wears the crown for the work I actually do. She held his gaze, steady, unflinching. Whatever this is between us, it has to be between equals, or it can't be anything at all. I've spent 5 years being someone's floor. I'm not doing that again. Not even for something good. Something moved across his face, not surprise. Recognition, maybe. A man hearing exactly what he'd already decided he needed to hear. I have never once, in my life, he said quietly, wanted anything except an equal. The stable was quiet around them, just the horse, shifting its weight, the soft creak of old timber settling into morning light. Neither of them moved to close the last small distance between them. Neither of them needed to, not yet. Some things were worth letting arrive in their own time, the way spring arrives in the north, patient and certain and entirely worth the wait. Then we understand each other, Marin said. We do. She stayed a while longer, brushing the horse's other side in comfortable, wordless rhythm beside him, and let herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply exist in a moment without calculating what it might cost her. There's a particular kind of woman this story was always written for. The one who spent decades being the floor someone else, stood on a marriage, a household, a family that assumed her steadiness came free, simply because she never once charged for it. Marin didn't win by becoming someone else. She won by finally refusing to keep disappearing inside her own usefulness. That part isn't just hers. It never was.